Matthew is a historian and activist focusing on police and technology. His writing can be seen in NBC News, Slate, Time Magazine, and the Washington Post, and he's the co-editor of the Essential Kerner Commission report. He holds academic affiliations with University of Indiana, Indianapolis, and Emory University, and is currently a senior policy analyst at the civil liberties organization, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where he focuses on how police departments use technology. Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out. I'm really excited to be here tonight because it's such a great space, and because this is, after 10 years of working on this project in one way or another, actually the first time I get to talk about it in New York City, which is great because it is the city that obviously inspires me the most and which really kind of brought me to this project. I was born in this city. I was in grad school at the city when I started thinking about this project and wanting to write a history of the NYPD. I did a vast majority of my research here, and so I'm just really excited to get to speak here of all places. And so the book really kind of makes a few main arguments about policing in New York, but I think it's kind of a bellwether for policing everywhere, not just in the rest of the United States, but I think because by the early 20th century, policing is so collaborative and so international that I think that writing a history of the New York City Police Department kind of really made me think about policing and really kind of like points to trends that happen both in the United States more broadly, and also I think you really could trace innovations in policing in the NYPD in places around the world. So I think one of the key arguments was that the modern police department, it was created, it was assembled at a time when race and talking about crime were virtually the same thing. Now we live in a world in which police like really maintain this veneer of colorblindness in which they say, you know, we're not talking about race, we're talking about crime. But in the early 20th century, when the police department was being built, when it was being formed, talking about crime was to talk about race. There was, at that moment, a very explicit understanding that some people were more biologically or psychologically predisposed to crime than others. And so you had to build a police department that worked across cultural, linguistic, racial, ethnic divides. And they built a police department which they thought could do very much this. But as cities got more diverse, policing faced a kind of a crisis point in the early 20th century, which is really the focus of the book, which is that policing doesn't work. It does not work in a city in which, you know, dozens, hundreds of different languages are spoken, which there are cultural differences and linguistic differences and ethnic differences. And when you have a police department that is, by 1900, something like 85% American-born, English-speaking, monolinguistic police department, it turns out it just doesn't work. And so it really begins this process of experimentation, where the NYPD is literally going around the world trying to find ways of methods, technologies, anything they can find that will allow them to police a multiracial and multi-ethnic city. And they stumble on a few things which I can talk about. They steal some things from the US empire. They steal some things from empires overseas because these are the, you know, kind of regimes that are most accustomed to having a police force that speaks a different language and is culturally different from the people they police. And what they land on is something that I call surveillance policing. And it should sound familiar because it's very much the regime we still kind of live in. And this is where the point of like, I am a historian who was trained in late 19th and early 20th century history, but my day job is as somebody who works in activism and technology policy now. And so for a while, I kind of like kept those two worlds siloed. And it wasn't until I was writing this book and like trying to map this period of like the 19 teens and 20s that I realized that I was kind of talking about the same thing in my day job and as a historian, which is this style of policing called surveillance policing, which is what police eventually arrive at when they're trying to figure out how to police such a diverse city, a city where, you know, it went from being 80% native English speaking to under 40% native English speaking in a span of 25 years. That's how diverse New York got in this period. And what they discovered is technology. They tried to fill in these gaps with technology because, when fingerprinting is imported to the United States, it was like magic back then, because suddenly you didn't need to be able to talk to witnesses. You didn't need to be able to communicate them whether or not you spoke the same language. You didn't need to be able to earn the confidence and trust of communities, because they might not distrust you. They might distrust you. They might not want to talk to police. They might not want to be witnesses. And suddenly things like a fingerprint at a crime scene meant that you could solve a crime without having to talk to people in the community. You didn't have to communicate them. You didn't have to earn their trust. Things like teaching police how to identify makes and models of cars, teaching them mnemonic devices for memorizing license plates very quickly, all became ways in which you could use new methods and new technologies that meant you could kind of pave over this deepening chasm between the police departments and the communities they patrol. And so in my day job, when you see things like Amazon Ring doorbells, and when there's a crime, police, the first thing they do now is canvass for surveillance footage. They go to their automated license plate readers. They go to all this technology. It has allowed police to continue this century-long process of relying less and less and less on collaboration and communication with communities. And I think this really starts in this early 20th century, when there's this crisis point of how do we go into immigrant neighborhoods where nobody speaks English? How do we go into Black neighborhoods where nobody wants to talk to the police and still solve crimes? And the answer then was to lean into technology, and that process has been ongoing. And speaking of kind of assembling the police department, I think if you look at the world and you see that police look similar in Hong Kong or in Buenos Aires, or if you look all over the world and you see the police generally kind of look alike, there is a kind of an expectation. There is a sense that one can assume. There's an assumption that policing emerged everywhere because it is a kind of natural product of modern society. And I think very much police and people who support kind of like harsh law and order politics also are invested in making you believe this, that there is no way to envision a society without policing, because police are a natural development of organizing ourselves into an industrialized world. But what I really wanted to show in the book is that the police department there's nothing natural about it. That the reason why it looks alike all over the world is because it was meticulously exported and imported. It is a collaborative endeavor. It is a collaborative composite of tactics, of methodologies, and physical materials from all over the globe. So if you think about something like fingerprinting was developed in India as part of British occupation in India, and was brought to London, where it was very successful, and then was brought to the United States with much fanfare at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where it was introduced to American law enforcement like it was this brand new cutting edge. Like I said, people really did kind of treat it like it was magic. Going back before that, I mean, during the era of slave patrols, the dogs that were used to chase like self-emancipated individuals were imported from Cuba. The Cubans, for some reason, had a reputation for breeding dogs that were incredibly good at this. The criminal file, as we know it, comes from Germany. The idea of a modus operandi, that a person who commits one crime continues to commit that style of crime forever, that comes from Italy. And even today, if you look at our surveillance equipment, a lot of the surveillance technology that police use in the US today is imported from places like Israel. And so you have policing that is meticulously built. It is a collection of pieces assembled from all over the world. And it really, like I said, it did not emerge naturally. It was something that was really hoisted on societies across the world through imperialism, through collaboration, through warfare, through all sorts of stuff. And it's funny, somebody was recently critiquing, I think just a review they read of my book on Twitter. I said something like, you really expect me to believe that like police in New York were writing letters to police in Tokyo. They were like sending telegrams, and they collaboratively built this system. And I was like, well, yeah, that's exactly what happened. Is like starting in the mid 19th century, police were sending emissaries to other police departments to learn as much as what they could and bring it back. The NYPD was receiving police from all over the world. There were police chiefs who, if you go into their records, were in correspondence with police chief all over the world, sharing tips and advice and sending each other techniques and technologies. And so policing really was this kind of collaborative global endeavor. And New York really was a central hub in that. There were a number of people in New York, whether they were in the NYPD or not, some were university professors, some worked for kind of nonprofits, and all of them had this web of correspondence across the world. And the other thing is that policing really helps define the boundaries of race in America. Just as race contributed to creating the police department, police thought, to control crime in an era when certain races were deemed criminal, you had to police those communities, right? Like, you couldn't just police crime, which is just an amorphous thing. You had to make a calculation of who was most likely to commit crimes, and that's the neighborhoods you would put under surveillance. That's where you would have the cops. That's where you would focus control and harassment and the violence. But police also, in turn, race made police, but police also made race. Policing really was, as I argue in the book, a kind of engine for making whiteness. That when you had all of these European immigrants coming over from Southern and Eastern Europe, they weren't quite white, but they also weren't not white. They were, if you look at literally Italians when they come over from Italy, their immigration cards say the race is Italian, complexion is dark, color is white. So you have, like, in the actual bureaucratic paperwork, a sense that they were white, but also like not quite white. And policing helped groups like the Irish, like Germans, like Italians, like Jews, learn how to become white in America. And I think this happened in a few ways. One was, and they say this very explicitly, is there's really two types of violence that the police enact in the city. There's an inclusive violence and there's an exclusive violence. That police in immigrant neighborhoods understood the work they were doing as they were making future Americans. That when they, clubbed somebody on the head or they arrested somebody, they were teaching them the official and unofficial rules of how to be an American. They said, like, we are doing more to make these people into Americans than any book, than any English language class, that we're teaching them how to behave American. And police really understood that as part of their job. So even though they were still, like, beating people up and arresting people, in European immigrant neighborhoods, they really understood what they were doing as kind of a vote of confidence that these people will one day become upstanding white Americans. And then there was just explicitly exclusive violence. The violence that police did in Black neighborhoods and to a somewhat lesser extent in Asian neighborhoods really was like not a type of violence whereas we are teaching you how to be Americans, but we are excluding you from the amenities and the civil participation that comes with being an American. So just, for instance, a Black woman being on the street in the early 20th century, her presence would have been deemed by police such a threat to the kind of civil order of society that just to claim the right to walk the sidewalk was to open oneself up to violence from the police force, because their very presence was deemed a kind of threat to law and order. And so that is a picture of like what the very exclusive style of violence was. And the other way that policing created whiteness, besides just, making some people, teaching them how to be white Americans and excluding others from urban society, was participation in policing. The Irish initially became so much of the police force by 1860 in the Civil War. over half of the entire police force in New York City was born in Ireland. And this happened very simply in exchange for votes. That you did not apply to become a police officer in the 1860s. You had to be appointed by your local alderman. And people saw this as a good paying middle class job. That for a working class Irish immigrant to become a cop was like a road to middle class respectability. And so your local alderman would hand out jobs on the police force in exchange for votes. If you, your kinship network, your cousins, your family, if your whole neighborhood votes for me for alderman, I will make you a police officer. I'll make your friend a police officer. And this is how, in exchange for votes, so much of the police force became Irish so quickly. And it's why to this day, the NYPD culture, the internal culture, is like very much based on kind of Irish traditions, still lasting from this period. And the same thing kind of was true of Germans who came over in large numbers around the same time. But by the end of the 19th century, suddenly there is another reason to recruit immigrant officers, and it's because they have linguistic ability. Police needed Yiddish speakers, they needed Chinese speakers, they needed Italian speakers, they needed Russian speakers, and so they went into those communities and they recruited very heavily. And this kind of these first generations of immigrant police were kind of the vanguard of whiteness for their communities because they had a good paying middle class job. They were involved in the government of the city, which was seen as kind of a respectable thing to do. It seemed like you were participating in the city. But also you got to use violence to differentiate yourself from people who were never going to be assimilable into New York society. So, for instance, Irish police got to prove their whiteness by beating up Black New Yorkers, by showing that they could participate in the collective project of white supremacy, by Irish immigrants saying we know we're not quite white, but we are certainly not like them, allowed a generation of immigrants to prove their whiteness, to prove their belonging in an American system that was very much predicated on Black marginalization. So yeah, I mean, I think really navigating race created the modern police department as we know it, but also policing helped create the boundaries of race in America in really interesting ways. I just think there's an amazing, pretty anti-Irish picture from the 1863 draft riots, in which Irish working class New Yorkers rebelled. The city was, a lot of it was burnt down. There's a lot of violence, a lot of racial violence against New York's Black community to protest the draft into the Civil War. And in part, this would happen because working class Irish people did not want to compete for jobs with emancipated Black New Yorkers. Again, this is part of that using violence to differentiate themselves from Black Americans. And so there are all these pictures, these hand drawings in the newspapers from the 1863 riot, in which the rioters are depicted as like small and kind of ape-like and brutal, and the police are tall and they wear their long blue uniforms, are without wrinkle. But statistically speaking, both the rioters and the police were Irish. They were Irish Catholic. And so you could see even in these images the idea that to participate in violence on behalf of the state, to become a cop, was to be the first of your kind of kin to prove your whiteness, to prove your belonging. And so I think those are kind of some of the key arguments of the book. And so the story really progresses in these stages, which is, at first there is an understanding of what makes a good police officer. And this is very much entwined with race. Because on the one hand, there is incredible reluctance and fear that so much of the police force became Irish so early on. There's something I talk about in the book called the Policing Civil War of 1857, which is suddenly the state government of New York, which is mostly Protestant, a lot of the kind of Anglo-Dutch elite from descending from the original colony, looked down at New York City and realized that a vast majority of the police department was Irish Catholic. And because Irish people had this reputation for violence, for alcoholism, for corruption, based on all these kind of racialized assumptions of Irish people, the state government creates a second police force in the city of New York, the Metropolitan Police Force. And this was staffed almost exclusively with Protestant, English-born people from New York City. And so for the better part of a year in 1857, there are two police departments policing the city who are very much at war with each other. They spend more time fighting each other than they do anyone else. And this kind of extends into their kind of street gang equivalents. So like if you've seen Gangs of New York, the Bowery Boys, which were Protestant and very nativist, very against Irish, fought on behalf of the Metropolitan Police. And the Dead Rabbits Club, which was mostly Irish Catholics, fought on behalf of the old municipal police force. And it ended when the mayor was arrested and the municipal police force was finally dissolved. And then, of course, the Metropolitan Police Force becomes the NYPD, and they absorb a vast majority of the Irish Catholic police officers anyway. So there's this hunt for what makes a good police officer in the 19th century. And Irish people, there's a lot of reluctance about it, but at the same time, because police was so predicated on just how good were you at beating people up, how good were you at doing violence, there was a begrudging acceptance that, well, we have to have a lot of Irish on the police force because they're the best at beating people up. And there's this like real racialized understanding and gendered understanding of who makes the best police that has very much a lot to do with race and ethnicity. By the time Theodore Roosevelt is the president of the Board of Commissioners of the NYPD, he actually writes this pamphlet called An Ethnography of Policing, where he ranks the races based on how good they are at policing. Where at the top you have native-born police, or native-born Americans, right below that you have Irish, and then going all the way down to, I think, Jews and Greeks were at the bottom, for various reasons. But he said that the longer an immigrant group stays in America, the better they get at policing. That he had this kind of idea that there was still a sense of meritocracy, that these newborn immigrants who didn't quite jive with the American way of life, they could get better at being American and by extension get better at policing the longer they stayed. So the old system of policing ends, the handing out police appointments in exchange for votes. And Theodore Roosevelt, his big contribution is creating the civil service exam, which is to some extent how people still become police officers now. They have to apply, they have to take a test. And the test was oriented around Roosevelt's hierarchy of policing. It was made to favor American-born, English-speaking officers because they thought those were the best police officers. And so by 1900, 1901, 1902, you have a police force that has, over the span of a decade, really kind of prioritized hiring English language speaking people. Of course, this is where, though, immigration is at its high point. So you have a police force that mostly speaks English, operating in a city that for huge swaths of which don't speak English. And so suddenly we get to the crisis point that I was alluding to earlier, where all of these people, beat cops, detectives, journalists, politicians, professors, are all wondering, like, how do we build a police force to police such a diverse city? And so they go all over the world looking for how do we solve this problem? And one of the key places they go to is the U.S. Empire. So after 1898, the United States goes to war with Spain, takes over its colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and the U.S. Army occupies places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And a lot of these police officers and a lot of these, especially higher ups, the commissioners, had been in the Army. You know, there's a kind of revolving door in this time between policing and the military. And so you have people like Francis Vinton Green,
or William McAdoo, who were commissioners of the NYPD between 1903 and 1906, who had been generals on the ground in the Philippines. They had to answer to the president, how do we govern an archipelago where there are a lot of different languages spoken and where the occupying force does not speak those same languages, does not understand the culture, does not understand the geography, and that they borrow tactics from the British Empire, they borrow tactics from the French Empire, and they built things like the Philippine Constabulary, which is a centralized police force made up of Filipinos who were dispersed to every corner of the archipelago, because they figured, well, this is the way we have to do it. What England called native policing is we have to get people who understand the culture, who understand the language, who can kind of infiltrate and penetrate those spaces that white American military officers couldn't. And so you get these generals who come back from Empire, and they arrive at New York at a time when they're asking the exact same questions. How do we police these huge neighborhoods where there are hundreds of thousands of people who don't speak English, where there are neighborhoods we can't even navigate because there are alleyways and hidden attics and basements where not even the rent collectors know where the apartments begin and end and who's living where. Certainly the police don't know. And so you have these people who finally realize that they're asking the exact same questions they were asking in Cuba and in the Philippines, so they start instituting some of the exact same solutions. So in 1904, you get the German Squad, which was a centralized group under the commissioner of just German-speaking officers. And they recruit German-speaking officers from all over the city to come be part of the squad and to handle emergencies and crimes having to do with German speakers. That same year is the formation of the Italian Squad, where it starts with just 6 officers in 1904 who are all Italian-born, they all speak Italian, and they're responsible for all the Italian crimes in the city. And by 1909, those 6 members becomes 112 members because they are so desperate to find people who can speak languages and go into these neighborhoods. The same year, 1904, they also recruit Warren Charles, the first Chinese-American officer, to the police department, which Warren Charles is a really interesting case because he kind of defies the typical the typical story here, because in with the Italian case and the German case, these people are really eager to be deployed to their own neighborhoods. In part, they think they're like helping to uplift their neighborhoods. They said all of the kind of middle class business owners in Little Italy, they want to collaborate with the police force. These Italian police want to participate in this because they think they are weeding out the troublemakers in the neighborhood. They think they're weeding out the people who are keeping Italians from becoming respectable members of American society. But Warren Charles, the first Chinese officer, he had started out as an informant. He eventually got recruited into the NYPD, and he absolutely refuses to work in Chinatown. He goes to a beat in East New York. And every few years, with a lot of fanfare, the commissioner offers him a spot in Chinatown, and he says I don't want to be directly. He said, I don't want to be a sideshow attraction. I don't want people coming and gawking and seeing, look at this, a Chinese man wearing a blue uniform. And in some ways, he was pretty prophetic because when the NYPD eventually recruits the first black officer, that is exactly what happened. It becomes a tourist attraction. People line up his beat to see a black man in uniform. And so Warren Charles kind of refuses to collaborate in this style of kind of native policing and infiltrate his own neighborhoods. And so while the NYPD was very desperate to get a lot of these people onto the police force, who they were not desperate to recruit were black police. For decades, black people across the country had been deeply invested in this idea that the way to curb police brutality is more black officers. I mean, we still hear that argument today. And cities like Chicago or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, who had much larger and much earlier black communities than New York, already had integrated their police departments and had, pretty sizable amounts of their police force were black. In New York, it took decades of really intense activism to push the NYPD to recruit its first black officer, which eventually does in 1911. Even though, I mean, it's quite different, the NYPD really felt like it needed Chinese officers, it needed Italian officers, because there were whole swaths of the city that they couldn't understand, that they couldn't police properly. They didn't obviously they didn't understand needing black officers in that same way, and yet when Samuel Battle, the first black officer, is appointed, he's sentenced to San Juan Hill, which is the first the densest and most populated black neighborhood in the city at the time. And he immediately says, like, all the other cops on the beat are white and they need me so much more than I need them. Like, he understands himself through the lens of kind of these early immigrant officers, where he describes himself as a translator for the police force. Even though there's not a linguistic divide, he understands it as being enough of a kind of cultural divide and as much of a trust divide between the black community and the white police, that he sees himself as being as essential as early immigrant officers who could speak different languages. And eventually this model of policing, of recruiting people to kind of go into their own neighborhoods because they understood it, it died away for a number of reasons. One is which by the 19-teens, there's an incredible distrust of immigrant men, including those on the police force. By 1921 and 1924, the U.S. passes some of its most draconian immigration restriction acts, where they virtually shut down immigration from Europe. And in part, it's because there is a terrible fear amongst American-born Protestant politicians that there are too many immigrants in the country, that they bring with them too much criminality. Especially, there's this incredible panic over sexual violence, that there's this real fear that especially immigrant men from Southern Eastern Europe, Chinese immigrants, and especially black men, that there's this nationwide panic of what they called the white slave panic of the 19-teens, which is that these foreign men are sexually exploiting white women and selling them into a kind of coerced sex work that we have to put a stop to immediately. And it grows a distrust of immigrant men, even if they're on the police force. It ends in a virtual shutdown of all immigration to the United States, and it breeds this distrust, especially against this one police commissioner named Theodore Bingham, who wrote book after book after book about the white slave panic. He was obsessed with the sexual exploitation of white women by immigrant men. He had this real fear that there were huge swaths of the city where the only people who policed them were immigrant men. How can we trust these men? How could we know that they're actually in these neighborhoods helping to thwart and not enable some of these crimes that they were really worried were happening in immigrant neighborhoods? And so they start to phase out these immigrant squads. The Italian squad, like I said, goes from its high point of over 100 men in 1909 to discontinued by 1910. They end it. And all of its Italian speakers get redispersed to other communities. And instead, what replaces it is they want to make not officers who are skilled because of the things they grew up knowing, the things they know from their own community, but they really want to prioritize classroom training officers. They want officers to, rather than come into the police force speaking Italian or speaking Russian, they want to send them to Columbia's foreign language program to learn those languages. They want to make officers who are capable of policing any community at any time, regardless of who they are or what they know. And so this is where kind of the real standardization of the police force comes into play, where you might not necessarily want to invest the time in either recruiting Russian speakers or training an American-born officer to speak Russian if they can go into a crime scene in a Russian neighborhood and just find a fingerprint. You don't need to prioritize that kind of knowledge about about policing. And so this era of experimentation kind of came to an end by the World War I era, by the 1920s, where the rise of standardization, the rise of professionalization, the rise of the bureaucratization of policing. Police in the 1910s, the NYPD start hiring statisticians, where they say, we want you to map on a map every crime that happens in the city, every car accident, and from the statistics we'll learn where crime will happen in the future. We don't need to, the detectives don't need to know the neighborhoods, they don't need to know who the troublemakers are, because the statistics will tell us. And so they really kind of go from prioritizing this innate learned knowledge of officers walking a beat to this kind of academic and scientific knowledge, which, to this day, if an officer takes the stand in a court of law, they're treated like a scientist. They're treated like somebody who has a lab degree in finding crime and finding criminality. And that really comes from this era where there was a concerted effort to make it seem like police were experts. A generation earlier, police were essentially considered robots who could beat people up. And now by the 1920s, there's this real idea that no, they're scientists, they're intellectuals who know the science behind crime, and it comes out of this attempt to build a police force that could a sustainable way to police a very multi-ethnic and multiracial city. And the coda to this story is that if you study policing history long enough, you'll see that nothing ever really goes away for long. That I call it policing's very small toolbox. They really have just a set of tools and tactics. And if you watch the history of policing long enough, you can watch them come back. And sometimes they come back with new names, they have new justifications, there are new sociologist reports that say it worked, but it's the same old thing. So in the 1960s and 70s, there's this grand innovation where police are going to get out of their cars and they're going to walk the beat. They're going to get to know their communities. And they call this community policing. And it's supposed to be this brand new cutting edge thing. But it's native policing. It's ethnic policing. It's this colonial tactic, which had been tried and true in the 19aughts and 1910s, where they're just, the whole strategy is to get to people who can speak the same language as their community, who know their community members, who can get out of the car and walk the beat. And so it's not new. It's just a recycled thing. And this happens with stop and frisk. It happens with using more violence. It happens with using less violence. It happens with more surveillance or less surveillance. Attempts to build community trust, and then attempts to take away community trust. All these things come back over and over and over again, or reforms that are introduced eventually become part of the problem and are taken away and then are reintroduced later. So, for instance, the whole issue with the NYPD, which is still always in hot debate, is whether or not officers should be able to patrol the communities where they live. In the early 20th century, this was considered a recipe for corruption, because if you knew the people you were patrolling, you were more likely to let some things slide. You were more likely to arrest people you didn't know versus your friends. You were more, you let crime happen. And so to avoid corruption, suddenly they mandated you can no longer police the neighborhoods where you live. And so a few decades later, people were like, this is wild. We have all these police who are coming in who don't know our neighborhood, who don't know us. This has got to end. We've got to start recruiting police from our neighborhood. So all these things that are called reforms, if you live long enough, they become part of the problem, and the things that were the problem become part of the reform again. And this is why I think to be a historian of policing is to, in many ways, develop a kind of a police abolitionist worldview, is because you see that policing as a technology, no matter how much it claims to change, no matter how much people try to change it, it really has a very limited set of tools and strategies, and they always come back, and they always produce the same the same results, which are supposed protection for some, and just violence and exclusion for others, because it is these people who are deemed an innate threat to the rights of the other, of the majority group, which in the city is, it is always, to protect and serve white and rich people, and who are you protecting and serving them from? Crime is just an amorphous category. Like I've said, since the very beginning, there has to be a calculus of, well, who is most likely to commit crime? We will exact our retribution, our violence, our harassment, our surveillance onto those people, which in this city has always been Black and immigrant and working class people. And so, I think when you study the history long enough, you can see these things recycle and come back, and you realize that it's a kind of to study history of policing is kind of a deja vu experience. And then the final thing I'll say is police kind of get the final say on writing their own history. They kind of get to preserve, in part because they control their own archives. The NYPD archives from a lot of this period were destroyed. We don't really have access to it. And police get to write the dominant narrative of the history of their own institution. And I finished the book and the conclusion with just two kind of physical manifestations of this, which is the intersection of 135th and Lenox is now Samuel Battle intersection, which is named after the first Black NYPD officer. And it was named that in 2011 by Ray Kelly, who is kind of one of the more maligned NYPD commissioners in the modern era. And he enacted that at the height of the stop and frisk crisis. So at the time when he renamed that intersection after the first Black officer, close to 300,000 Black men a year in the city were being stop and frisked. And there were protests happening almost weekly at that time. And so here comes the police commissioner to unveil this intersection where they talk about how he was a hero of community policing, which didn't quite exist then in the same way it does now, but also talked about how, Samuel Battle had to survive racism from both white people on the street who didn't want to take orders from him and from his fellow officers, white officers who would beat him up in the precinct, who were very rude to him. And so suddenly the story of racial violence and the NYPD in the past becomes who is the real victim of racism is Black officers. If you talk about the history of racism and policing, the victim, according to NYPD, are the first generation of Black officers who sustained so much and become this triumphant figure in the civil rights pantheon. And the other one is Kenmare Square in Little Italy, which in 1987 became Joseph Petrosino Park, who was the first Italian detective in the NYPD and the leader of the Italian squad. And 1987 is the kind of the high point of public distrust of the NYPD. It's in the middle of kind of the highest point of crime rates in the city. And they say on the plaque, if you ever go down there, the plaque is that he was a hero of integrity and social responsibility. That in a sense that the rise of crime in a neighborhood is not necessarily the fault of policing. It's not necessarily the fault of the city. It's about personal responsibility. It's the 1987. I mean, this is like classic Reagan era economics of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like if there's crime in your neighborhood, it's your own damn fault. It's not the NYPD's fault. And Joseph Petrosino as being somebody who was supposedly the sick of crime in his own community, who took it upon himself to join the NYPD and try to clean up his own community, is so in keeping with the politics of the 1980s and so not in keeping at all with the politics that led to Joseph Petrosino's appointment to the NYPD in the first place, that both he and Samuel Battle kind of become these containers into which the NYPD of these varying eras can pour their own politics and their own meaning, and they get to once again kind of recycle these tactics and these stories which make up this very small playbook that police have that I'm sure we will see repeated again and again and again. Granted, some of these technologies, they might be digital now. The statisticians who were trying to figure out what neighborhoods were the most safe based on arrest records, crunching numbers on Mott Street are now, for-profit, private, untransparent algorithms. But the philosophies that guide these technologies are the exact same as they were in 1904, and a lot of the moral and ethical problems are not popping up because these technologies are new and they're digital. They're popping up because they are being guided by these same kind of racist and immoral and unethical philosophies which guided their pre-digital versions in the early 20th century. And I could talk a lot more about that if you all are interested. But I think that's all I'm going to say. Thank you all for coming. I'm very eager to have a kind of intimate conversation with all of you. So thank you all for being here.
I appreciate the history, especially the interaction or the dialectic of the police force and its history and development with the idea of becoming white, or being in the spectrum of, becoming white.
Yeah.
Or not quite white because, I don't know who it was, maybe James Baldwin said, Irish people don't know they're white until they come to the United States. Or Germans don't know they're white until they come here, and then that whole process begins of the pecking order and all. And I'm glad you brought it up to date. And if I heard you correctly, you're saying basically the same problems repeat, sometimes recede, sometimes move forward, and but they continue. And then you said something about abolition. So I'm wondering what, as an activist, I'll just 30 seconds. I've been working with a coalition called Campaign for an Elected Civilian Review Board. Because it's not just policing, it's like police accountability. Like, how do we get to abolition? I believe, there can be a world without police, but it's not going to be this class divided capitalist system. And so we need a way to get there. So we've been working for 7 or 8 years on something called the Community Power Act, which the Democrats who run this city now basically killed. We had Charles Barron as a primary sponsor for this elected and empowered board that would oversee police. And I'm just wondering what you are doing on that account. Like, what do we do about the problems that, are presented by policing today? Because they don't kill people in Charlottesville, but they do kill people and beat up people at Black Lives Matter protests.
Yeah.
Following, George Floyd and so on. They kettle people and they beat them up, but they don't beat up people, on January 6th in Washington, D.C. So these problems that you're talking about is historical are still very much.
Yeah. I think part of the solution is just is to begin to take away certain tasks from police. I think the quickest way to some harm reduction is to limit the amount of interactions police have with people. And I think if that is taking the management of unhoused people in the city away from police, and a lot of cities have created crisis hotlines for people in mental health crisis, or teams that outreach teams that specifically work with unhoused people, or a lot of cities are experimenting now with creating unarmed divisions who are responsible for all of the traffic enforcement. It's just slowly take bits of the responsibility away from the police and giving it to other institutions, and sometimes having to create those other institutions. And the other thing that I've been working on a lot is community oversight of police technologies. I've worked in a number of cities where we've passed laws that, something as easy as before police acquire a new piece of technology, they need to get it voted on by a democratically elected city council. They need to publish a use policy, and they need to allow for a public comment period. Because in so many cities, people have no say at all in what and police departments spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for an untransparent AI predictive policing algorithm that is going to spit out names, and police will say we just use it as a lead. It's just a lead. It's just a way to start an investigation, but immediately go out and arrest that person. And it turns out they weren't even like in the city that day of the crime was committed. And this happens all the time with face recognition too. I mean, Detroit alone has arrested, I think, 6 black men and 1 black woman falsely accused by facial recognition without any follow-up investigation. And so I think starting to like wrest some control over how much of our policing is being directed by for-profit, untransparent technologies is something that I've been spending a lot of time working on. And it's like, it's a start. I mean, it is not. It is not. I think it is certainly coming from a philosophy of harm reduction, but I think it is like a pivotal step that a lot of cities have been taken and have had success in doing. And so I think it's a worthwhile endeavor.
Your earlier comments were about a sort of internationalization of policing, and how similar or not are standards in New York compared to other, well, not other countries, but other lands.
Yeah.
And I was reading recently that I think it was maybe in the 70s, please correct me if I'm wrong, that there were limits that if an officer's IQ was deemed too high or too low, then they would be basically barred from joining the police force in New York. And I don't know if that's uniform in the U.S., but
Yeah.
is that? Do you see that in other lands too?
In other countries?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely like whether or not an officer like needs to have a college degree is something that shifts not just from country, but like city to city in the United States. Like, I think, somebody correct me, I think you don't have to have an associate's or bachelor's degree to be in the NYPD, but you need to have a certain number of credit hour. You need to have like, at least I think it's like 2.5 years of college credits in order to apply to the NYPD or something. So like that was a reform that people thought would really kind of change. Like there are all these like trying to do this calculus of like, okay, what is going to make police on the street less likely to use violence? And the amount of education given to them is one that has been a theory since the era I'm talking about. In like around 1914, the NYPD creates a bunch of partnerships with universities in order to send officers to night school because they think that will make them better officers. It'll make them less likely to be brutal. It will make them better equipped to handle a more diverse city. And it will also open them up for promotion. So I think that is a philosophy, education is a philosophy that, very much varies from city to city. In terms of other requirements, I know for a while it was like there were height requirements for the NYPD, which over the years has been lowered as a kind of a diversity initiative, I think. I mean, it was just like, we need to have a more diverse police force. We need to get more women on the police force, so we've got to lower that. It can't be 5'9" anymore, We've got to lower, and so like that's been a weird calculus that it might be different from city to city, but I know the NYPD had wrestled with a lot over the years. So there are a lot of like weird recruitment regulations like that change over time, I think, based on what type of person the NYPD wants to recruit.
When you were talking about Teddy Roosevelt and his list of who's a good police officer, what metric is he using? Is he saying good at keeping rich white people safe, or good at solving crimes, or what was he going for?
I think it's I think being kind of charismatic and outgoing on the street. It's like having a public presence. It's the ability to do violence is chief of mind. I think it's also getting along with other officers. It's like leadership qualities, whatever that means. So, for instance, he puts Greek people at the very bottom of the list as making the worst police officers, in part because he says, like, there was never a Greek officer who did not get into a fight with every member of their precinct. Jewish officers he thought were like too short and too passive. Like he had, and a lot of these were based on kind of like ethnic stereotype. And so there were like a lot of different metrics, but a lot of it was like, also entwined with like understanding of like what desirable traits were for American masculinity at that time. They had to be tall and stoic and outgoing and the ability to do violence, but knowing when not to do violence. And all of these things were kind of twined with like, what is the idea of like proper progressive era manhood?
Yeah. I think in the book you touch on the militarization of the police and the police beginning to receive like surplus equipment from the military. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about when that really starts in New York and what spurns it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is such a revolving door between the military and policing that I really don't think there is ever a time when the police are not militarized. I mean, the whole the philosophy originally behind police departments in England, so they say, was because you could not have a standing army coming in whenever there was like urban unrest, like whenever there were strikes or riots. You couldn't have the army coming in. You had to have a kind of civilian force to manage unrest. But at the same time, the first police force was modeled after the Irish constabulary. Like it was military and it was imperialist from its very origins, even if it's in its philosophical origins in the UK. So I mean, I think it is kind of always military in posture in its understanding of us versus them, and its understanding of like the fight against crime is a war on crime, as old as policing itself. But I mean, I think I would argue is this period between the 1898 imperialist war with Spain and World War I is really when you see generals with military training become the ideal candidates for becoming police commissioner. It's when you have an increasing number of officers who have military experience. And by World War I, there's this philosophy of preparedness, where the United States really thought there was like a chance people would invade the United States during World War I. And so the NYPD begins like drilling in khaki uniforms with rifles. There are all these like mock battles they do on Staten Island where they have to like defend the coastline against a mock invasion. And so the idea that like a mass European style war could make its way to U.S. soil really kind of I think jumps into overdrive a process which had been already ongoing, which is this kind of like a militarized posture by the NYPD, but like khaki uniforms, long guns, machine guns being rolled down Fifth Avenue in parade, all of that really, I think, really is the World War I era. And continues. I mean, by the 1930s, riots in the United States are being put down by tear gas, which was used in World War I on the battlefield, and which by then had been declared a war crime to use on the battlefront, but still can be used in a domestic context, apparently legally.
I'm looking forward to reading your book. Do you cover in your book fusion centers and how they change policing, and also I have another question about COINTELPRO.
Ooh, yeah. Happy to talk about both. I don't know if I think I explicitly mentioned fusion centers in the conclusion as being part of this like kind of infrastructure in post 9/11 policing. But I think, I mean, it is interesting because there is a philosophy of law enforcement based on the European model that from the early 20th century people think U.S. policing is too regional. That it should be centralized, because in Europe, a lot of police forces are centralized. They are run by the federal government. They cover the entire nation, and for a lot of people in the United States, they thought that was a kind of like a more rational way of doing it than like having like tens of thousands of little police departments who are kind of like answerable to nobody. And then you put on top of that county sheriffs and state police, the whole thing just becomes a kind of like jurisdictional nightmare where nobody is really sure who's in charge of who. And so I think fusion centers are a representative of, in the post 9/11 period, I think the Department of Homeland Security really becomes the closest we can get to fulfilling the dream of a lot of people in this book of having a national police force, where you have a centralized police force. And J. Edgar Hoover really kind of wanted the FBI to do that. He wanted the FBI to be everywhere and to be the national police force. And kind of, when he opened up the National Fingerprint Bureau, where all the police forces in the United States were supposed to supposedly send their fingerprints to this national bureau, really kind of made some important bureaucratic moves to make the FBI the federal national police force. But it never quite took, for several reasons. But I think after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security, the moving of immigration and Customs and Border Patrol under the new Department of Homeland Security, the creation of fusion centers, which for anybody who's not familiar are these regional centers that take intelligence from local police forces and feed it up to the Department of Homeland Security, and which take information from the Department of Homeland Security and feed it to local police departments. So it's this kind of like federalizing of local law enforcement, but also like feeding sometimes like awful local misinformation up to the federal level. Like, I mean, I think the Maine Fusion Center has gotten in trouble several times for like just like copy and pasting like InfoWars articles about protesters gonna throw firebombs at the federal courthouse in Maine, which like the Department of Homeland Security gets on high alert because like some guy in a local police department in Maine sent it up the chain of command and like started like a national incident because he read an article that he got scared about. So fusion centers, I think, are like, they have a very particular place in the long history of like, what should policing be in the United States? Should it be localized? Should it be federal? Who should be in charge of it? There's a kind of like wanting to have their cake and eat it too. A lot of like libertarians are like, I like my local police force, get the federal government off our backs. But at the same time, federal policing and local policing have become so entwined since 9/11. And I think fusion centers are very much at the heart of that. And you had a question about COINTELPRO?
Yeah, have you, in your research, did you come across any anecdata or anything about the resurrection of COINTEL or COINTELPRO tactics in New York or elsewhere in terms of organized harassment, blacklisting of people who are discreet breaking and entering into a person's house, deputizing civilians in neighborhoods to monitor others, in essence, Stasi-like tactics. Have you come across anecdotes?
Yeah, I mean, in part because, and there's a lot of really good scholarship which is coming out. Like, this is, I think, you've hit on something that I think is like the next kind of cutting edge wave of scholarship, and there are going to be a number of really good books about this in the next few years, is that we give a lot of attention to the FBI as doing all these shady tactics and infiltrating and undermining and sabotaging the civil rights movement. But a lot of that was happening by local police departments, including the NYPD. And a lot of police departments had inherited from the 1920s and the period I write about what they called red squads, which were squads whose sole purpose was to infiltrate the labor movement, radical groups, communists, socialists, anarchists, and any mid-sized police department in the United States by the 1930s had a red squad. And by the 1950s and 60s, in part because there was a very purposeful effort to make it seem like the civil rights movement was a kind of communist front organization. A lot of these red squads, which had survived the decades in these local police departments, including the NYPD, kind of get folded in and become part of the infrastructure for trying to dismantle the civil rights movement. And the NYPD is certainly no exception to that. In fact, a few years ago, there was a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit which uncovered like a warehouse in Queens filled with thousands of hours of surveillance video from the 50s, 60s, and 70s that the NYPD had taken, which are mostly activists, which are mostly student activists, anti-war activists, racial justice activists, and that this wasn't the FBI, this wasn't, this was the NYPD.
Is that the evidence warehouse that mysteriously burned some months ago?
No, I think that's a different one. But there's a long history of evidence mysteriously or not so mysteriously burning. I think an important part of the history of government surveillance is burning the evidence of that surveillance at some point. There is an FBI field office in, I believe, Birmingham, Alabama, whose basement flooded a few years ago, and what was lost was a huge amount of FBI files, probably about the civil rights movement, that we'll never know because this flooded basement in Birmingham destroyed all these records. Maybe. I mean, the FBI got in trouble in 1975 because they had an official designation called "Do Not File," which was they had a stamp that said "Do Not File," and if you got one of those documents, it just went straight into a furnace. But my next book project is next year is the 50th anniversary of the Church Committee report, which was a Senate investigation into illegal surveillance and sabotage of the civil rights movement, illegal domestic surveillance by the FBI, CIA, and the NSA, which was this big bombshell Senate investigation, which led to this big bombshell report that came out in 1975 and led to a lot of reforms, which lasted not very long, especially not after 9/11. But that report kind of provides, I think, a really important blueprint for what a deep diving and really effective Senate investigation could look like of something as secret and as shady as the intelligence community. And so I have the unenviable task of, over the next few months, trying to take about 5 or 6 volumes of this congressional report and trying to make it 250 pages for an abridged 50th anniversary edition, which will hopefully be coming out next fall. So keep your eye out for that.
I think there's been some, I've read comments about how people felt like the church committee, although there was an airing of that, it ultimately was futile because it didn't really lead to any fundamental change, despite there being an airing of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I mean, I think the creation of the Senate Intelligence Committee was an important step because before that, the only person who had the power to know what the hell the CIA was doing was just basically the president. And so the creation of a permanent select Senate Committee on Intelligence at least created the infrastructure for some kind of oversight. I don't think they necessarily envisioned that the Intelligence Committee would become just like a rubber stamp factory that would just like approve things and let a lot of really horrific mass surveillance through. But I think it made a cultural impact. I think it capitalized on half a decade of distrust of the government, from the JFK assassination to Watergate to the exposing of COINTELPRO, the leak of the Pentagon Papers, like all these things built 10 years of distrust of the government, and I think they were really able to capitalize that, and I think they were really to help to guide a culture of criticism against the government, against the intelligence community. So we might not have gotten any lasting legal or institutional reforms, but I think it helped to further along the cultural skepticism about the good a CIA could do or the FBI was doing.
Were you hindered in your research at the NYPD? Did you put in some FOIL requests that weren't fulfilled?
Yes and no. I mean, most of the work was old enough that, so in 1921, the NYPD took all of its records to a paper mill in New Jersey and destroyed it. So there's nothing from the NYPD before 1921. And so I was kind of foiled, pun intended, I guess, by having to just go out and find where I could find information because there was no central NYPD repository. The closest I ever got to filing a lawsuit in researching this book was there used to be something called the NYPD Museum, which was down by South Street Seaport and which was totally destroyed by Hurricane Sandy. And one of their last exhibits was about the NYPD Italian Squad, because Joseph Petrosino, the leader of the Italian Squad, some great niece of his opened up her attic and found boxes of materials from the Italian Squad, and it became the basis for this exhibit at the NYPD Museum. The museum was destroyed by Hurricane Sandy. All of its collections are in a lockup, a storage unit somewhere in Queens. And I wanted to try to see this material. But because the museum is so defunct, I could not get in touch with anybody. So finally I was cold calling the people who served on the board of trustees for the museum, who were all real estate brokers and investment bankers, and they're just they were just they were on the board. And eventually somebody returned my call. They put me in touch with somebody who was a curator at the museum, who is now works in the nonprofit, I think the American Cancer Association. And they were listen, the museum isn't coming back anytime soon. You can't get into that storage unit until we hire a curator. We're probably not going to hire a curator anytime in the next 10 years. So the best I can do is I have photographs of what was on the walls at that exhibit and use it however you want. And that was the because I filed a FOIA law. I sent a FOIA request to the city saying I am compelling you to go into that storage unit and get me these documents. And they just, the NYPD is one of the worst, least transparent agencies. I think I have had better luck getting documents out of the CIA than I have out of the NYPD. So that was the closest I got to threatening legal action so I could get into this storage unit, and it didn't end up working. So,
speaking of transparency, do you know how many precincts the NYPD or satellite offices they have overseas?
Yes, because this week it went up.
Oh.
It was 11 NYPD satellite offices in cities around the world, and I think as of this week it is 13.
Do you know who the newest additions are?
I can't. I think Sri Lanka is one of them, and one more that I can't remember. But they are all over the world. Yeah. And it's really interesting. I mean, the NYPD really is a kind of an intelligence agency in and of itself with a thriving international presence. And I think the book kind of reveals some of the origins of that, where, I mean, I didn't mention it here, but the leader of the Italian Squad is sent to Italy with the cooperation of Italian police and the State Department to try to find evidence that he could use to deport Italians in New York. So the 1903 Immigration Act says that if anybody has committed a crime overseas and immigrates to the United States, they can be deported from the country where they came. And so the NYPD and the State Department had a list of people, Italians in New York, they wanted to deport. And so they sent this New York detective to Italy to like scour through police departments to see if he could find arrest records for any of these people so he could get them back and deport them. And while he's in Italy, he is assassinated in 1909. But there's like a long history of NYPD going abroad in search of specific criminals who have fled the United States, or in this case, in search of evidence they need to deport people. So yeah, I mean, I think NYPD, because it's such an international city, because there's so much back and forth between Europe or other parts of the world and New York City, I think the NYPD has always had to be pretty international. And I didn't anticipate when I began writing this book that I was going to have to like have such an international focus, but like very quickly it became impossible to ignore. Thank you all so much for coming out.